Okay, today we're going to talk about some very interesting and I think very rewarding literature, the modernist novel. We're going to talk about English language novels today. Um, Around this time, I think you start to get a separation where if in the 18th century and the 19th century, novels were a form, they were generally serialized, written for a public. They were written for a very literate public. They were written for an intelligent public, not quite as dumbed down as of a public as, say, we might know today in the beginning of the 21st century. But nonetheless, they were essentially for the general literate reading public, and they tended to be serialized in uh, public publications, newspaper-like things that they had in the 18th and 19th century. You see in the novels that we're going to look at today a kind of separation where you get a more popular fiction in the 20th century with many excellent and brilliant writers working in it, genre fiction of all kinds, but then also what you call, for lack of a better term, sort of serious fiction, where artists have realized by the end of the 19th century that the novelistic form is one that has really almost infinite possibilities in terms of expressing subjectivity, in the same way that painters realize that the visual medium has a sort of infinite plasticity potentially. People realize the same thing about the linguistic medium of novel writing and the size of the novel, the scope of the novel. So, so we look at some really extraordinary work today. Some of these novels, some of this reading that I'm going to uh, talk to you about today is very difficult reading, but I do encourage you, if you're a literate-minded person, to tackle it. We're going to look at four different writers today. The Modernist novel, that's a painting by Gustav Klimt there, who otherwise we aren't talking about here. Prose and consciousness. So again, now you already are well equipped to understand what I'm saying there, because we've been talking about painting and notably about French Impressionist painting. Uh, and so this idea, this turning inward and sort of looking at human nature, studying human nature, but also these people are studying language and the role of language. And sometimes this literature, modernist literature, is after all more philosophically interesting in some ways, I think, than most literary genres that we encounter in world literature. And we will look at some more world literature before the end of the class. We are sort of running out of time, but we will do that. So, so the modernist, so let's talk about what modernist literature is for two slides, and then we're going to look at some specific examples. The period, very roughly, because we are talking here about general humanities and general intellectual history. So we're not trying to be like an art historian or a historian of literature and pin down some sort of real exact uh, work to work time frame. Roughly, we're talking about the end of the 19th century and then the first 2 or 3 decades of the 20th century, where we really see a flowering of this. And as I alluded to before, I'm going to talk to you about English novelists today, but on the continent, with French writers, German writers, Italian writers, Svevo, and many others, there's all kinds of great literature from this period. It's all philosophical in the way that I'm talking about, all modernist in the way that I'm talking about. So, of course, I'm going to talk about English ones. These are the novels that I've been able to read in the original language, of course. Uh, but realize that, like modernism itself, the modernist novel is definitely an international affair. So, so the second bullet point, Impressionism, again, a great deal of similarities with the Impressionist movement in painting. The novel itself is the work of art, not what the novel is talking about. Just as with Impressionist painting, we see with the modernist novel that the form is going beyond its traditional representational function, beyond its perhaps storytelling function, and moving into its own as a medium of artistic expression as such. So that's the first thing that relates this this period of novel writing to Impressionist painting and the post-Impressionist painting that you see on the other video I'm posting this week. And the second, of course, is the same, that we have a fascination with subjectivity, the nature of experience, perhaps the structure of experience. And we're going to get into that the next couple of lessons. Third bullet point, the themes now are these themes that that are familiar to us in modernism. You sort of see the intelligentsia or the bohemian world kind of taking sides now, but it's more complicated. You not only have a rejection of traditional religious teaching, which is seen as sort of pre-scientific and irrational, but you also have a newfound alienation and suspicion of modern science and industrialization and urbanity. As I say, this is what relates modernism to romanticism that came before it. Again, Franz Kafka, an Austrian writer, T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound, both English poets who deal with a great deal of allusions. What is an allusion? Allusion is a reference to some other past literary work or other work of art, or perhaps a famous person. This is difficult, after all, because if you aren't familiar with the subject of the allusion, then it's going to go over your head. Ezra Pound, in particular, almost every line that he writes is, among other things, referring to some other line from the canonical literature. That is characteristic of modernism, again, in as much as they're feeling the weight of all the culture that's come before, and they're very self-conscious of history now. And then the modernist novel is also, like all good literature, it's funny. Why does all good literature have to be funny? It might be important enough to even step out to make the point. All good literature has to be funny for the same reason that all well-lived life has to be funny. That is, when you go up to meet St. Peter, he's going to decide, and he's going to want to know, did you have a sense of humor? Did you understand that it was all a big joke? Because if you didn't, you're going to be in trouble with the big guy upstairs, okay? And so, again, I think every really deep expression of human experience, which it necessarily involves two things. It necessarily involves the suffering that is incumbent upon us as embodied beings, and it also is funny. It's funny because life is funny. Okay. So, all right. So it's very funny. Oh, I'm going in the wrong direction. Typical. So what about technique? And of course, this is more interesting. Intensely psychological, inward looking. The story that's being told is often the story about the thought processes of the character. So you have interior monologue, the private thoughts of a character sort of related to you, as if you're in the character's head. Sometimes this is simply done by being in the first person, but often it's not. Henry James, for example, will often just be standing back and describing the thought processes and emotional processes that are happening inside the character's head. So that, very personal, but then this point of view, the point of view from being inside the interior monologue of a character, will shift from person to person, from character to character. Now, this is important because to appreciate the literature, and notice the second bullet point here. You know that you have moved from the mind of one of the characters into the mind of the other character, or a different character, if this is done well, because the personality, the intelligence, the attitude, benevolent, malevolent, everything about the character will be conveyed indirectly through this mastery of a voice, the creation of a new voice, a voice that's got its own accent, a voice that's got its own mannerisms, a voice that is distinct, that you can recognize. So if you come back to that voice later in the text, you'll recognize which person it is. But for the writer to do that, I mean, think about a portrait painter painting different people's faces. Now think about the novelist is moving from the interior monologues of one character to another. And the only thing that's telling you when that happens is that this voice changes. Okay, and so this is something that these artists make look easy. You might not even notice this going on, but it's incredibly difficult to do. Compare that to jumping around in time, jumping around from character to character, and then jumping around from time to time. And then add them together. You might be jumping around in time with flashbacks and forwards, and you might be moving from one character's head to another. So again, a very demanding literature that really requires that you be paying a great deal of attention. Lots of other meta-narrative tricks. And open-ended endings, not necessarily good endings. Again, serious art, not merely aiming at entertainment, but the artist is aiming a little bit higher. And I would call it a magical style after magical realism of Latin American art. Man, the birds is loud. In that surrealism does intrude, of course, comes with the territory of this sort of post-Cervantian meta-narrative sensibility that is very, very much a part of modernism. So let's look at then quickly 4 modernist writers. First one is Henry James, really a precursor to modernism. An excellent writer to learn from. If you're a young person who's interested in being a writer, you might want to read some Henry James to sort of show you how it's done. He is William James's brother. We've seen William James before, the pragmatist who taught at Harvard for many years, taught psychology. Principles of Psychology is the first American book to have psychology as title. It might be one of the first books to do that. Well, Henry's his brother, and Henry spent most of his life outside of the United States. He was kind of conflicted, and he would be sort of accused by people of sort of being ashamed of being American or being kind of a phony because he tried to be an Englishman. I don't think that's entirely fair. He knew perfectly well who he was, but he really did sort of want to participate in sort of the old world kind of legitimacy and I think maybe depth of texture of the English identity. He is a writer about the encounter of the Americans, the New World, with old Europe. Europe being sort of the old corrupt and cynical Europe. Europe is the horrible, cringy old man, right? That's the psychological dynamic. And America is the innocent young person who's coming out into the world, all bright-eyed. He is a social realist. He starts, as many of these writers do, writing 19th century style social realism, talking about injustices, social difficulties and social injustices. He slowly evolves until by the end of his work, he is working on these intensely psychological novels, these late period novels, which are the really difficult ones and the ones that you should look at. Between there, one of his most famous works, The Turn of the Screw. These people, I use the word Edwardian there during the time of King Edward, right around the turn of the century, right at the beginning of the 20th century. And these people were very interested in the spirit world and seances and life after death. That was kind of a thing for a while there. And people were reading William James that way, like he was writing sort of these scary Stephen King ghost stories. And actually nowadays, when we look at Henry James, what we see are he's writing psychological thrillers, sort of psychological horror. He's talking about, and he was so sophisticated about that at the time they could be written as read as sort of gothic horror stories. All right. Also having to do with his psychology. a very complicated person. He's from the United States, but he wants to live in England, but he's on the side of the Americans, but he understands the limitations of them. He's also a sexually ambiguous man. So a lot of sort of depth and texture in his perspective. Portrait of a Lady was the book that established him. Sort of the stereotypical narrative that I was just explaining. Isabel Archer is young and rich. The Americans at the beginning of the 20th century with lots and lots of money compared to a lot of Europeans. So you have the European with their title and their nobility, but you've got the American who's got $1 million, and that's sort of another sort of standard trope of these kinds of social realist comedies of manners involving the Americans and the Europeans from the first part of the 20th century. There's Henry James in the middle of all that. In a way, sort of Henry James establishing stereotypes that we have about Americans and Europeans. I would go so far. His cultural influence is that big, I think. The Turn of the Screw. Again, the governess is left alone with the children. There have been some recent deaths in the house. The parents are kind of absent, and the governess sees these two people talking to the children. She thinks there are people talking to the children. The daughter is sent away eventually, and so what you have also is unreliable narrator here. You're not sure what's going on with this governess. She thinks she's saving the children from ghosts. In the end, she wakes up and again, it would appear that she has killed the boy. So as in Dostoevsky, you have an exercise in showing sort of creeping insanity or insanity overtaking a character. Again, Henry James, quintessentially modernist in that he is absolutely a psychological writer. If he is interested in logic, the logic that he is interested in is psychologic. Okay. The Golden Bowl, I mentioned that those last novels and the Golden Bowl, one of his very last novels, and that's why I mentioned it to you, because he gets into this. It's describing someone's character and someone's psychology in the third person usually, but taking it out into metaphorical depths, in terms of trying to express something about a personality. I mean, Henry James is digging deep to try and produce something. So listen to this, talking about a person. He's talking about a person, all of this. It argued a special genius. He was clearly a case of that. The spark of fire, the point of light, sat somewhere in his inward vagueness, an inward vagueness that he has, as a lamp before a shrine twinkles in the dark perspective of a church. Mood, chiaroscuro. And while youth and early middle age, while the stiff American breeze of example and opportunity were blowing upon it hard, had made the chamber of his brain a strange workshop of fortune. So follow that along. This establishment, the establishment of what? Of the workshop of fortune in the chamber of his brain, I guess. Mysterious and almost anonymous, the windows of this chamber in his brain, at hours of highest pressure, never seemed for starers and wonderers. Perceptively, to glow must in fact have been during certain years the scene of an unprecedented miraculous white heat that no one saw, right? The receipt for producing which it was practically felt that the master of the forge could not have communicated even with the best intentions. Got that? The master of the forge could not have communicated, even if he had the very best intentions. The receipt, namely the explanation for producing the miraculous white heat, which was a perceptible glow inside the vagueness, the stiff American, the chamber of his brain, the strange workshop of fortune. Yeah, that's where it is. That's where all that stuff is. So this is your exercise. This is your exercise in following Henry James, that you're going to try and hang on to what it is that he's trying to express. And, devil take the hindmost. And what he's trying to express is something about character, something about the nature of a person. Okay, so Virginia Woolf, a wonderful writer. She had a difficult childhood. Her mother died when she was young. Her father when she was a young adult. And she was sexually abused, and she committed suicide. But before we decide that Virginia Woolf is totally Debbie Downer, I would say that it kind of is reductive of her to make of her just a kind of victim of depression. I think there's much more to Virginia Woolf than that. And I think that, of course, depression being a sign of high intelligence in many people, we are told. But also she came from a very interesting family. Her sister was Vanessa, married to Clive Bell, a noted literary critic. She was part of the Bloomsbury group. She and her sister are brilliant young women who knew all of these important young intellectuals. And so she was part of this coterie of rebellious young English intellectuals who just had a very, very high time of it, indeed, in the early part of the 21st century. And she was very, very famous for her wit and her sharp tongue. It's a lot about World War I. England lost, I believe it's between 25 and 50% of the young men of England between the ages of 18 and 30 were killed in World War I. World War I, one of these times when the dress of warfare and the military technology combined for very, very high casualties. So there were tremendous losses for the English. And then, of course, Virginia Woolf, intensely self-aware person who writes A Room of One's Own. She also writes 3 Guineas about equal pay, among other things. That's reducing it. A Room of One's Own, the necessity for one's own space. It's arguable that Woolf, I think, is actually the very best practitioner of the stream of consciousness style of modernist literature. She is in it in her early novel, Mrs. Dalloway, but even Mrs. Dalloway, what we were doing is accompanying Mrs. Dalloway in her travels and her business during the afternoon, and her private thoughts. By the time we get to the waves, we really just have maybe 6 centers of consciousness kind of in an empty space expressing how they feel about being or something like that. And I want to get to that. Don't miss the waves if you like Virginia Woolf, because it's really great. There she is. She's always got the same expression on her face. Again, Mrs. Dalloway. Mrs. Dalloway herself, one of the things we'll notice when we get to James Joyce next with Stream of Consciousness, it tends to be a little shocking, a little transgressive, because after all, if you're being authentic about it, as you all know, since you're all human beings, as you go about your business, you do from time to time have sort of inappropriate thoughts and feelings. That's just human, but we usually hide them because we're usually polite. Remember, we've been talking about Freud recently in this class as well. So here we see a contemporary of Freud. These modernist writers are his contemporaries. And they too are saying, look, there's this underside of unconscious, pre-reflective stuff, and stream of consciousness style is a way of sort of allowing that stuff out. And so she's having these kinds of thoughts. And then when she's having her society party, a disturbed war veteran nearby in the city commits suicide, and she's told about this and finds it disturbing. So Mrs. Dalloway, another sort of ghost story. There's a lot of ghosts, I think, in Virginia Woolf too. The ghost of the war. Orlando is highly experimental, entirely different thing. Orlando is a nobleman from the 1500s, but Orlando turns back and forth from a man into a woman, from a woman into a man. So, and then he, or she meets all of these famous historical characters over an epic sweep of the 300 years that Orlando lives. So Orlando is a real classic, and among other things, a gender bending classic, again, from 1928. As I say, the waves, you have 6 characters, that is to say, really you have 6 voices kind of expressing themselves, and gradually their voices kind of converge. And so that's what the waves is. And it's really cool. Okay, here's the waves. And here also the sharpness in Virginia Woolf, the edge that Virginia Woolf has. There is then a world immune from change, but I am not composed enough, standing on tiptoe on the verge of fire, still scorched by the hot breath, afraid of the door opening and the leap of the tiger, to make even one sentence. That is, she feels stifled. She can't make even one sentence. And this world is immune from change. What I say is perpetually contradicted. Each time the door opens, I am interrupted. I am not yet 21. I am to be broken. I am to be derided all my life, she says. I am to be cast up and down among these men and women with their twitching faces, with their lying tongues, like a cork on a rough sea. Like a ribbon of weed, I am flung far every time the door opens. I am the foam that sweeps and fills the uttermost rims of the rocks with whiteness. You're on your boat. You're in the middle of the little bay. You can see the rocks around the edge of the bay. There's a rack line the water comes up to, and there's like white stuff on the rocks. You ever seen that? She says, that's what I am. And I am also a girl here in this room, she says. Okay. James Joyce, one of my very, very favorite writers, a real inspiration. He is Irish. He grew up all his life in Ireland and got educated in Ireland, went to college in Dublin. And then when he was 22, he left with Nora Barnacle, his wife, his mother of his children. He lived with her all his life. He taught English. He taught English in Trieste in Italy for a long time. He did go to Ireland. He would visit Ireland if a relative died or he had book business and that kind of thing. He made several trips to Ireland, but he didn't stay long. But he only ever wrote about Ireland. He never wrote about anything other than Ireland. Irish identity is complicated because Ireland was sort of overrun over the centuries by the English. And so you have this English aristocracy, the Anglo-Irish people, who are the people of English descent, and the English language, and this is really important for James Joyce. The Irish language, the Gaelic language, was in wide use in Ireland all the way up into the 18th century, the 1700s. It was really with the depredations starting in the late 1600s under Cromwell in England, and then going up through the times preceding the potato famine, the Irish uprising of 1798, I believe it is. And then, of course, you have the potato famine in the 1840s. And so the Gaelic language gets displaced by the English language. At the time James Joyce was writing at the turn of the century, there was something called the Irish Revival. It was among playwrights and poets. But there was also an attempt to bring back the Irish language, to save the Irish language, which was unsuccessful. You can still, I have been in little hamlets on the west coast of Ireland where the ladies in the sandwich shop were speaking Gaelic, the Gaeltacht, you call these areas. They exist, and you can even have the Irish language TV station in Ireland. But anyway, the point is that you have a situation where there's an old language not even like, English pushing in on Spanish or something like that, but much more heavy thing that you see more like in colonialism. I mean, you have an old language, a folk language that really isn't spoken anymore, but it's still around. And one of the reasons why Ireland does so well in literature, Ireland, for a very small country, produces a lot of world literature. It's very well known for that. In the same way, for example, that Puerto Rico is a very small country that's known all around the world for its music. So there are just elements in Puerto Rican culture that make Puerto Rico a very powerful producer of popular music, and all the world knows about Puerto Rico. And all the world knows about Ireland because of Ireland's literature. Ireland has always been a very powerful engine of writing. The other thing I want to, so he's got all these issues about identity because he doesn't feel all that comfortable about the Catholic Irish, but yet he is one of them as well. So that's something that I think a lot of people can relate to. The other thing I want to mention, last bullet point on the slide, notoriously, James Joyce had a lot of problems with censorship. His masterpiece Ulysses was not published in the United States for almost 20 years after it was first written because there were obscenity trials. Now, when you just hear that, you might think that that's because there's sort of a lot of sex scenes in the book. There are not. He does have sex with his wife right at the end of the book. It's not something that's portrayed in any particularly very realistic or sexual manner, I must say. But so then what's going on with the censorship? With Joyce, with the stream of consciousness. And because he is like an apostate Catholic and a rebellious person, he lets the stream of consciousness all hang out. So it's not just thinking about sex, but also thinking about, bowel movements and that kind of stuff, just, really uninhibited, because that's the way that the interior thoughts are. They just come. You only think about what you're going to say when you're going to say it, but what you're thinking inside is another matter. And so, like it or whether or not that's your cup of tea, that is the thing to understand about the censorship of Joyce, the censorship of Ulysses, is he's censored because he's writing an extremely uninhibited naturalistic style about what it is to be in a human body, not because he's salacious or sexual or anything like that. He's he's an endlessly conflicted Catholic guy as far as all that kind of stuff goes. All right, there he is. Kind of ironic that he has become a tourist selling icon of Irish identity when his whole career was spent sort of satirizing and critiquing the banality and shallowness of the Irish bourgeoisie. But I don't digress, actually. All right, let's talk about some works of James Joyce, again, one of my favorite writers in the world. The Dubliners, a short story collection early on, actually made him quite famous. The Dead, the famous American director John Huston made a movie out of the short story The Dead. It's the last story in the collection. And it's about a school teacher, Gabrielle, and he goes to his two elderly aunts, have an annual Christmas dinner. I would particularly recommend, if you remember, if you ever look at the short story The Dead, check out the description of the table laid with the food. The description of the table laid with the food in The Dead is one of the most amazing couple pages of writing you're ever going to see. And he works for a newspaper that's owned by unionists. Those are people who are against Irish independence. And there's an Irish nationalist woman who's a guest at the dinner party, and she criticizes him for this. And he feels hurt. He's kind of bothered and upset that she said that. He's not sure. He doesn't think it's fair. And later on, when they go home, he finds his wife sort of looking off into space at the top of the stairs. And he says, "What's going on?" And she was in love with a young man who died when she was very young. And she tells him about this. So all of this humbles Gabriel, and it's snowing. He's looking at the snow, and he has an epiphany, a moment of realization. And it's actually a spiritual moment where he really feels sort of at one with the world, because he's coming to understand that in Ireland, these ghosts of the dead, ghosts of the Irish past, are always present. His masterpiece, Ulysses. Ulysses, I've been through Ulysses a couple times, and the second time through it, I read it, and then maybe 10 years later, read it again. And it's really funny. I mean, when I first got through it, I was just struggling to understand. And, I was young. I didn't understand a lot. I just persevered because I really wanted to read it. But then later on, again, as I read it again, I realized what a funny novel it is. In Ireland, people will tell you, oh, well, nobody really reads, well, no, well, no, we do. I really read it. So what is it? Leopold Bloom, who sells advertising for a newspaper, is going around trying to sell. He also spends a lot of time in bars because he's supposed to be selling advertising for the newspaper. So he wanders around the city, and there's all these pubs that he goes into. And what he is a satirical caricature of Ulysses, of Homer's Ulysses in the Odyssey. And he sort of has 18 chapters, each one mapping onto a passage from Homer's Odyssey. And he also adopts a different literary style for each one of the 18 sections. There's a different color associated with each one of the 18 sections. There's a different organ of the body that's associated with each one of the 18 sections. So this is an extreme kind of formalism where he's really making himself adhere to this. Why? In a way, it sort of randomizes things. And then the other thing is, combined with that, he's got this, it's in the stream of consciousness style. So within this matrix of all this organization that he's just sort of imposed on himself, you have this kind of densely impressionistic, subjectivist, kind of textured sense of his experience. And as I mentioned in the last one, I do think it's important to understand that the reason this was censored was because of the uninhibited earthiness of the stream of consciousness style, not because of anything else about it. Finnegan's Wake is not for everyone. He spent many years on Finnegan's Wake, and I admit it's to some extent unreadable. I have read other books about it and tackled it. I have tried to get all the way through it. It's not an easy thing. It does reward study, but it's pretty far out. Neologisms, made up words, making up new words. The thing is, if it makes sense to you and you can understand it, it's a word. Awake, of course, Finnegan has died and they're staying up with his body. That's what an Irish wake is, to see him off to the next world. You have, again, the Latin languages, the European languages, and they're running together with this Gaelic, the old folk languages that are bubbling up from underneath. So he's really kind of, pushing the very idea, he's pushing the very idea that he has to stay within the English language, really, I think. So here's a little excerpt from Finnegan's Wake. Sniffer of carrion, premature gravedigger, seeker of the nest of evil in the bosom of a good word. Seeker of the nest of evil in the bosom of a good word, you, who sleep at our vigil and fast at our feast, awake. You, with your dislocated reason, have cutely foretold a Japhet in your own absence by blind pouring upon your many scalds and burns and blisters, impetiginous sore and pustules by the auspices of that raven cloud, your shade, and by the auguries of rooks and parliament, death with every disaster, the dynamitization of colleagues, the reducing of records to ashes, the leveling of all customs by blazes, the return of a lot of sweet-tempered gunpowder didst unto dust, but it never struck your mudhead's opportunity. Oh, hell, here comes our funeral. Oh, pest, I'll miss the post. That the more carrots you chop, the more turnips you slit, the more Murphys you peel, the more onions you cry over, the more bull beef you butch, the more mutton you crack, the more pot herbs you pound, the fiercer the fire, and the longer your spoon and the harder your gruel, with more grease to your elbow, the merrier fumes your new Irish stew. Finally, Gertrude Stein, another American, Henry James and Gertrude Stein, both from the United States, but Gertrude Stein, like Henry James, choosing to spend her entire adult life living, in her case, in Paris. She and her brother Leo were famous and brilliant collectors. Leo Stein was a genius at acquiring art, and the collection that he built with his sister at the time, it was certainly was the best private collection of what I would call modernist art in the world. And so she had her apartments in Paris, which she filled with this art, and everybody was there. Ernest Hemingway and Picasso, very, very close with Picasso. So a legendary place to go. I want to talk a little bit more about the fact that she was William James's student at Harvard. Gertrude Stein, is a very proud woman, a very proud lesbian woman. And among other things, I have an idea to write something about this. She's an empiricist. She doesn't want to be sentimental at all. She wants to use these operationalist principles that she studied with the pragmatist William James at Harvard to try and produce insight and produce knowledge in a way that isn't in this sort of maudlin sort of trying to read off people's sentimental experiences. Rather, she wants to stay outside of that and approach things like Picasso is approaching things that, in fact, her writing is even sometimes called Cubist literature. So, and in doing this, she thinks she's going to maybe get a different kind of authenticity, a different kind of spontaneity, illuminate different angles, the same way the Cubist painter wants to illuminate different angles by bringing out different kinds of surfaces. So, all right, so here's a painting that Picasso made of Gertrude Stein. Apparently, she said when she saw it, she was very honest. She said, "Oh, it doesn't look like me," and he said, "Well, it will look like you." And I guess he was right about that. There she is with the painting, and you see those other works by Picasso on the wall behind her at her house in Paris. So the making of Americans. Now, Stein is not an easy writer to read. The making of Americans, she's, again, not wanting emotional manipulation. Seeing the sentimentalist, what do I mean by that? The writer is kind of speaking to you in conventional, polite terms and telling a conventional story. Among other things, she's saying that involves emotional manipulation. So you get a flat affect. Think of those flat surfaces of Matisse or Cézanne, and then a lot of repetition. And the repetition, again, is a way of, it's a mechanism of attention. It's a way of disrupting the traditional notion that you're following a narrative to draw your attention to other things. So even the making of Americans is very, very experimental. Tender buttons. We're divided into three sections, one called objects, one food, one rooms. Again, think of the still lifes of the postmodernist painters, Cézanne, Matisse, Picasso, looking at objects and pulling out sort of the planar relationships in a way, deconstructing the conventional picture of the object. And then doing the same thing with words themselves. Another thing that the repetition does, that the prose is working like poetry in that sense, that the words themselves, the cadence, the sound of the words is now being sort of detached from the meaning of the words. And she also will do that with dissociative pairings, tender buttons, not the sort of thing you think of usually as tender. So we saw that in Gogol, same kind of technique. Tender buttons, interpreted expression of lesbian polymorphic eros. What on earth could that mean? Well, again, you have square people see, ordinary objects like ordinary objects. Maybe there's some insight that we have if we are marginalized people maybe by virtue of, this is just me talking here, maybe by virtue of that marginalization, we can produce new insight and new knowledge. Anyway, something like that. Certainly Tender Buttons has the most erotic phrases and elements of anything she wrote. And then later on, 20 years later, she writes the autobiography of Alice B. Toklas. That's the one that everybody's always heard of. She was already pretty famous among the avant-garde, among bohemians, but she wrote this and it was a popularization. She put in a lot of juicy stories about Picasso and Hemingway and all these other people. And this book made Gertrude Stein rich and famous. When she traveled to the United States in the 1930s, she was hailed as a hero, greeted as a hero everywhere she went. I mean, and this is a really experimental writer. I don't think anything like that could happen today. Some people think there's a marijuana brownie, a pot brownie recipe in the autobiography of Alice B. Toklas. Actually, Alice B. Toklas wrote her, who is a real person, wrote her own cookbook, an actual cookbook, which has a pot brownie recipe, just for the record. All right. So again, notice this, what I'm calling a sort of almost an empiricist technique of staying on a surface in order to free the reader to approach the text in other ways than this sort of submissive way that we usually do. We're trying to figure out the sentimental purposes of the writer. Light blue and the same red with purple makes a change. The tone of voice is kind of cheerful. It's not a dark tone of voice. It shows that there is no mistake. Any pink shows that, and very likely it is reasonable. Any pink shows that, and very likely it is reasonable. Very likely there should not be a finer fancy present. Some increase brings a calamity, and this is the best preparation for three and more being together. The best preparation for three and more being together. A little calm is so ordinary, and in any case, there is sweetness in some of that. A seal and matches and a swan and ivy and a suit. A closet. A closet does not connect under a bed. The band of it is white and black. The band has a green string. A sight, a whole sight, and a little groan grinding. A little groan grinding makes a trimming such a sweet singing trimming. And a red thing, not a round thing, but a white thing. A red thing and a white thing. All right. Okay, so I wanted today to show you the more avant-garde, the more experimental, usually later excerpts from these writers. There are more conventional texts by them. But I think for our purposes, and looking at this in terms of part of the history of art, what we want, and I would, and if you're a serious literature fan, and I strongly recommend that you want to look at these more experimental, more impressionistic works by the modernist writers. So again, we looked at Henry James, Virginia Woolf, James Joyce, and Gertrude Stein. There are many other interesting writers. For another American, I would recommend William Faulkner. Alrighty, I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.